I want you to take a second, just like picture an ADHD kid in a middle school classroom.
Right, really try to visualize them in that
Yeah,
space.
chances are you are imagining the absolute classic stereotype, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing a student who is loud, maybe a little chaotic, constantly out of their chair.
Tapping a pencil a mile a minute.
Exactly. Blurting out answers, interrupting the teacher. It is, the squeaky wheel that demands attention. But what if I told you that the child who might actually be struggling the most with ADHD in that room is the one staring quietly out the window?
It requires a massive shift in how we view neurodivergence.
Hmm.
I mean, we have been completely conditioned by decades of pop culture to see ADHD as this external behavioral issue.
Right.
But for a huge portion of the population, it is an intensely internal experience that, quite frankly, rarely bothers anyone else in the room.
Which really forces us to ask, if the stereotype is wrong, who are the kids we are actually missing? So in this deep dive, we are pulling from some really fascinating clinical insights into inattentive type ADHD.
And we are pairing those insights with the operational details of a K-12 program in Georgia called MentalSpace School.
Yeah, our mission today is to shatter those outdated stereotypes of what ADHD looks like, understand the specific mechanisms that cause so many brilliant students to, well, fall through the cracks, and explore how new telehealth models are completely rewiring school mental health support.
Because when you look at the clinical data provided in our sources, the reality of the modern classroom is just vastly different from the cultural mythology we've built around attention deficits.
It really is.
So before we can evaluate the systemic solutions being tested in schools right now, we first need to define exactly who is being overlooked by the current infrastructure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we have this loud disruptor stereotype on one side, but the source material paints a radically different picture of what inattentive type ADHD actually looks like on like a random Tuesday morning at homeroom.
Right.
We are talking about symptoms that are essentially silent. It's the kid staring out the window for 20 straight minutes.
Or the student who starts a massive science project with incredible enthusiasm, but then just hits a total wall and runs out of gas halfway through.
Yes, the daydreamer.
And it goes deeper into the actual cognitive mechanics of their day. I mean, what does that daydreaming actually look like in practice?
Right.
Well, it looks like a student reading the exact same paragraph in a history textbook like 5 times and still having absolutely no idea what it says.
Because their working memory is just completely overloaded.
Exactly. Their own internal monologue is literally drowning out the words on the page.
Or it's the kid who is incredibly smart on tests. Like, they clearly grasp the material, but they are practically failing the class because of homework.
And it's not because they can't do the math problem.
No, it's because they forget their materials in their locker, or they lose the physical assignment on the bus, where they just, forget the deadline exists at all.
And to an outsider, it just looks like apathy.
It really does. But reading through the source notes, a different analogy came to mind to help visualize this. It's like a computer that has 100 tabs open in the background. The processor is completely overwhelmed, but to the teacher looking at the screen, it just looks frozen.
Wow. That captures the internal exhaustion perfectly.
Thanks. It just felt, very accurate to what they were describing.
It is. And what's fascinating here is the clinical context of this specific profile. If we look at the diagnostic criteria, specifically since the publication of the DSM-5,
Which is the standard diagnostic manual, right?
Right, the standard manual used by mental health professionals. Since that came out, inattentive type ADHD is actually now the majority presentation.
Wait, really? The majority?
Yes, it completely flips our cultural understanding on its head. The quiet, daydreaming, disorganized profile is the statistical norm. The stereotype of the hyperactive, disruptive child is currently the minority presentation.
Okay, so if the inattentive type is the majority presentation, the logical next question is, why are so many of these kids chronically overlooked?
And the answer, looking at our sources, lies entirely in the functional mechanics of how classrooms operate.
Right, the ecosystem of the school.
Exactly. The modern classroom is an ecosystem that fundamentally prioritizes order. So these students are routinely under-identified because their specific symptoms produce compliance, not disruption.
Compliance, wow. So they aren't causing a management problem for the teacher, so they just don't get flagged as a concern?
Exactly. And the sources are very specific about who falls under the radar here.
Yeah.
It is overwhelmingly girls, quiet kids, and high IQ kids.
Because they aren't, throwing spitballs.
Yeah.
They miss out on teacher referrals. They miss out on early parent concerns. The adults in the room just assume they're a little spacey.
Or they get slapped with that terrible label not living up to their potential.
Ugh, I hate that phrase.
It's awful. And the tragedy of the timeline is devastating. Because they are compliant, the adults in the room don't recognize the drowning until the student actually goes under. These students mask their struggles. They work twice as hard to maintain the illusion of functioning until the executive function demands simply become too great and their grades inevitably collapse.
But wait, let me push back on this a little bit or just ask a probing question here. Aren't IEP and 500 to 4 teams or, school psychologists, aren't they specifically trained to look for this?
That is what you would assume, yeah.
Right. So why are the literal experts in the building missing the high IQ kids who are drowning?
Well, it comes down to a structural limitation. The educational system is inherently reactive to disruption. Even the most observant, highly trained school psychologists are constrained by the referral pipeline.
Oh, because they never get the referral in the first place.
Precisely. If there's no behavioral issue, the teacher never sends them to the psychologist's office. That's the bottleneck. I mean, a teacher is managing 30 distinct minds in a single room.
Right. So if one student is screaming and another is quietly reading a book under their desk, the teacher's limited bandwidth has to go to the screaming child.
Exactly. Furthermore, high IQ kids are incredible at masking. They use their sheer intellect to brute force their way through executive dysfunction for years.
Oh, wow. So they just figure out elaborate workarounds.
Yes. They write the entire essay on the bus ride to school, or they rely on anxiety and massive dumps of adrenaline to meet deadlines.
So they're basically using panic as a focusing tool.
Yes, that is exactly what they are doing. And it matters tremendously that girls and high IQ kids mask their struggles this way, because it creates a dangerous illusion that everything is fine.
But behind the curtain, their central nervous system is in overdrive.
Exactly. They are internalizing the belief that they are lazy or broken. And this usually leads to a total academic and emotional collapse right around middle school or high school.
Right, when the scaffolding of elementary school, having one teacher, one desk, one folder, when that is suddenly removed, and they are expected to manage 7 different syllabi on their own.
Exactly. The support structure vanishes and they just crumble.
So if you were a parent listening to this, and you've ever watched your kid spend, 3 hours on a 20-minute worksheet crying at the kitchen table, this is the exact systemic blind spot we are talking about.
It really is. It's like they're being punished for being polite.
Yeah. Because they aren't a behavioral problem, they are denied the resources. So if the barrier for these masking kids is that they are essentially invisible, the only way to find them is to remove the friction of diagnosis and support.
Enter the MentalSpace school model in Georgia.
Yes. So let's look at how they are attempting to solve this logistical bottleneck. They are providing comprehensive K-12 mental health support directly for Georgia schools.
And we aren't just talking about a counselor who drops by a campus once a week. They're providing same-day teletherapy.
Right, and they assign dedicated therapist teams to specific schools, which creates a real continuity of care.
Plus, they cover comprehensive services. We are talking crisis intervention, suicide and violence prevention, staff wellness programs, and even family counseling.
And importantly, they are utilizing licensed, diverse, culturally competent therapists. They even offer full ADHD evaluations via telehealth with same-day intake availability.
Which is a critical bridge. I mean, consider the traditional mechanism for a parent trying to get an ADHD evaluation.
Oh, it's a nightmare.
It typically means noticing a problem, getting a referral from a pediatrician, languishing on a specialist wait list for 6 to 9 months, taking time off work to drive an hour to a clinic, and often paying entirely out of pocket.
Wow.
By bringing that diagnostic capability directly into the school environment via telehealth, they are removing the friction that keeps the quiet kids invisible.
Which raises some obvious logistical questions, right? Here's where it gets really interesting. Offering same-day teletherapy inside a middle school or high school sounds like an administrative maze. I mean, think about the privacy concerns.
Right.
Where does a student even go to take a therapy call during third period math? And more importantly, how do families actually afford it? Because a service like that sounds like something only a wealthy, elite private school could pull off.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the operational genius here is how they navigate those exact barriers.
Okay, tell me more.
First, on the administrative and privacy side, the entire system is fully HIPAA and FERPA compliant.
Okay, so HIPAA covers health privacy, And FERPA covers educational privacy.
Exactly. They have built the digital infrastructure to ensure that a student's health information and their educational records are completely siloed and protected.
Okay, so how does it work practically?
From a practical standpoint, a student simply gets a standard pass, goes to a designated private room in the counseling office, logs into the secure portal on an iPad, speaks with their therapist, and then just goes back to class.
Wow, so it really minimizes lost instructional time while providing that immediate intervention.
Exactly,
Oh,
which
yeah.
relieves the burden on school administrators who are understandably terrified of privacy violations.
Totally. But what about the financial accessibility?
This is a huge piece. They accept Medicaid, which is a massive lever for equity, alongside virtually every major commercial insurer operating in the state. So your Blue Cross Blue Shield, your Cigna, Aetna, UHC,
Oh, wow, so really all the big ones.
yeah, Humana, Peach State, CareSource, and Amerigroup, they aren't relying on some concierge, cash-only model.
Right.
And why does this matter? Because historically, immediate teletherapy was gated for wealthy families who could afford to just bypass the insurance waitlist entirely.
Yeah, exactly.
By bridging the Medicaid gap and integrating state-funded options, they ensure that a student's socioeconomic status doesn't dictate whether their internal struggles are recognized and treated.
Okay, so the infrastructure is there, the financial pathways are established, and the privacy is totally locked down.
Right.
But having an incredible telehealth infrastructure is essentially a bridge to nowhere if the families don't know they need to cross it.
Right. You cannot treat what you do not see.
Exactly. If a high IQ girl is masking her inattentive ADHD perfectly, her parents aren't going to seek out the MentalSpace telehealth portal. The final piece of this puzzle has to be shifting the culture of the school from reactive crisis management to proactive screening.
Absolutely. Because if a school relies on the old method of waiting for a student to fail before intervening, the new telehealth infrastructure just becomes another resource for the loudest kids in the room.
So how do we find the quiet ones? Well, the source material gives a brilliantly simple, actionable piece of advice for IEP teams, 504 teams, and general educators.
Yeah, this is great.
They recommend routinely sharing a free 3-minute ADHD screening with every single family. You can actually find the specific one they reference at chalktherapy.com/mental-health-tests.
But the key mechanism here is the routine nature of it. Teachers should share this at parent-teacher conferences routinely, not just when a concern arises.
Exactly. You don't hand it exclusively to the parent of the kid who's failing math. You hand it to everyone. You normalize the screening culture. The sources even suggest families can sit down and take the 3-minute test together.
And normalizing that screening culture is a profound intervention strategy. Think about how a parent usually reacts when a school suggests a psychological evaluation.
Oh, the walls go right up. It feels accusatory.
Exactly. But when a teacher hands out a screening tool as a routine part of a fall conference, just like a standard vision or hearing test, it completely bypasses that defensive posture.
Right. It communicates, hey, we check everyone for this because neurodivergence is common.
Furthermore, for schools in Georgia, this proactive approach intersects with a significant piece of legislation, House Bill 268.
Oh, right. The July 2026 deadline.
Yes, there's a looming July 2026 deadline for HB 268 compliance, which mandates clearer frameworks for student mental health and wraparound services. The MentalSpace model offers a really functional pathway for districts trying to meet those legislative requirements.
And the data provided on the outcomes of the MentalSpace School program gives us a real look at what happens when this works. We are talking about 89% improved attendance.
Which is massive.
It is. When you think about the daily dread of going to a building where you are constantly overwhelmed, an attendance bump makes perfect sense. They also report an 85% family satisfaction rate.
And you can find the blueprints for this at mentalspaceschool.com or reach out directly to MentalSpace School at chicktherapy.com.
Yes, definitely. But the metric that really demands a closer look is this: a 92% reduction in anxiety.
Wow.
So what does this all mean? I really want to dwell on the human element of those statistics. When we talk about school interventions, we usually talk in terms of productivity, right?
Yeah.
We want the kid to turn in their homework. We want test scores to go up. We want disruptions to stop.
Right. The focus is always on output.
Exactly. But a 92% drop in anxiety. We aren't just talking about molding a child into a better student. We are talking about fundamentally rescuing a child's daily nervous system. We are taking a kid who is secretly vibrating with panic every time the teacher asks the class to turn to page 42, and we're giving them their peace of mind back.
This raises an important question about the fundamental purpose of our educational environments. When you implement routine 3-minute screenings and back them up with immediate, accessible telehealth, you aren't just changing logistical
No,
workflows.
you're changing the culture.
You are destigmatizing mental health at the root. You are shifting the school's role from a system that exists to punish a problem to an ecosystem designed to support a mind.
I love that phrasing. Support a mind.
Right, and when a child's anxiety drops by 92%, they aren't just surviving the school day anymore, they are actually available to learn. Their cognitive load is freed up from managing undiagnosed symptoms, and they can finally just, participate in their own childhood.
It is a total transformation of the school experience.
Ah,
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's distill what we've actually uncovered in these sources.
okay.
First, we have to let go of the stereotype. ADHD isn't always loud, and it isn't always disruptive. For the vast majority, especially girls and quiet, high IQ kids, it is an internal storm of daydreaming, lost materials, and starting things they just can't finish.
Right. And second, compliance should never mean invisibility.
Exactly. Just because a kid isn't causing a problem for the teacher does not mean they aren't drowning.
And finally, systemic change is possible.
Yes. Proactive models like MentalSpace School, utilizing telehealth, navigating the insurance hurdles, and pushing for normalized screening are proving that we don't have to wait for a child to hit rock bottom before we offer them a lifeline.
The transition from a reactive model to a proactive, accessible model is the only way we ensure that the quiet struggles are brought into the light. It requires building an infrastructure that actively looks for the students who are trying their hardest not to be seen.
That's beautifully said. And to you listening right now, whether you are a parent sitting at a conference table trying to figure out why your bright kid is suddenly failing, or an educator looking at a classroom of 30 distinct minds, or even an adult who recognizes their own childhood in that description of the quiet kid staring out the window, understanding these hidden traits changes lives.
It really does. It changes the narrative from I'm lazy to I just have a different operating system.
Exactly. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've spent this time talking about how to better identify and support these inattentive traits so kids can function in a modern classroom.
Uh-huh.
But what are the very traits we currently pathologize as inattentive? Like deep internal daydreaming, or focusing so intensely on one single fascinating thought that the outside world just completely fades away. What if those are actually the exact cognitive superpowers needed for future creative and analytical jobs?
Wow, that is a brilliant reframe.
Right. Maybe the tragedy isn't that these kids have broken brains. Maybe the real tragedy is that they're being judged by an industrial-era classroom model that simply wasn't built for them.
It suggests that it's not the mind that needs fixing, but the environment that needs expanding.
Exactly. Well, until next time, keep looking beyond the obvious and keep diving deep. Thanks for listening.